Well, good afternoon, folks. Thank you for coming out. I want to thank Sarah and Bobby specifically for organizing this really wonderful event this weekend. And I really want to thank them for ordering up this great weather. I have been to Arcata for 11 different days in the last decade, and every day has been just like today. I'm beginning to think that there's some conspiracy among you to tell the rest of the world that it actually gets rainy and cloudy much of the year to keep the rest of us away. But I really have enjoyed my time here, and I'm glad to be here. What I want to do today is tell you about 3 different things. One is to give you an introduction to what my main work is, which is on the landscape corridors and their use, their promise for conservation. And then I want to run through what we know about the ecology of corridors that I've learned from 2 decades of experiments. And then finally, I want to come back around to what these corridors might mean in landscapes for people. But before I go into that, because it is going to get into the really nitty-gritty of this idea of corridors for conservation, I want to start with the biology, with the biodiversity that I love the most. And what I love the most is my work on butterflies. I happen to have had the chance to work on the very rarest butterflies in the world. I'm going to tell you about a few of them. The ones I'm not going to tell you about actually are the ones from the northwestern part of the United States, the Fender's blue and the Taylor's checker spots. They're work that I've gotten into in collaboration with folks that live up here. But I am going to tell you about 3 other species very briefly. The first is going to be the butterfly that may be one of the very rarest, the St. Francis satyr. If you can see the picture of me in the upper right corner, I'm standing in its best habitat, and that's why I have this big smile on my face. Actually, there's 2 reasons I have a big smile on my face. The second is that I have not yet been blown up by a bomb. I'm standing in the middle of a bomb range at a military base in North Carolina. I'm going to show you on the next slide the global distribution of the St. Francis satyr butterfly. It's in blue. If you squint, you can see it. There it is, that little dot, that speck on the page. This butterfly is only found at Fort Bragg Military Reservation. It at one time had a much wider distribution. It lives in wetlands that are formed by fires and by beavers that were both eradicated from the landscape 100 years ago in the eastern part of the United States. And the butterfly's distribution shrunk to this little spot and was maintained there because of the activities of the Army that started bombing in certain areas. Those bombs set fires annually, creating disturbances that kept the butterfly's habitat available for it. So that's one of the rarest butterflies. A second rare butterfly is called the crystal skipper. This butterfly is found on the eastern coast of North Carolina, my home state. And my former student Allison is looking at what is its best habitat. It lives on the dunes just next to the beach. Now, before I need to head off one issue that, I often worry that people think, God, Haddad, he really cherry picks his research sites to go work at these beautiful places. I want to tell you that these study sites are the most excruciating places I have ever worked. And the reason is that you're standing on these hot dunes, the sun is glaring at you from above, the sun is coming up at you from below off the sand, and you're running up and down these dunes, and the whole day you're watching other people having fun at the beach while you're doing it. But this butterfly lives in about a 30-mile stretch of this dune habitat, 30 miles long and maybe 50 meters wide. And only a little bit of its remaining habitat looks like this, because this is like prime beachfront property in North Carolina. So most of its habitat looks like This is a city called Atlantic Beach that goes right up to the ocean, covers up crystal skipper habitat. Here's people's vacation homes built right up to the beach. I mean, these are the people that had to build their house so close to the beach that they could just roll off their deck onto the beach in the morning and not have to walk too far. Now, these houses are right on top of crystal skipper habitat, but it's not quite as bad as it looks, because there are some places, and I've highlighted those here in gray, and here's an example of somebody's backyard. If people actually use native landscaping and landscape with the kinds of plants that the butterflies, caterpillars need to eat, then the butterfly will do fine in those places. But most of its habitat has still been lost. My student, Allison, liked to say, if we're measuring conservation in city blocks or people's abandoned lots, then we know we have a conservation problem. And then finally, this may actually be the rarest butterfly in the world that I've started to work on. This is the Miami blue butterfly. The Miami blue used to be found throughout South Florida. Actually, its best habitat was where Miami is now. It used to be throughout South Florida, but now to find the Miami blue butterfly, I have to get on a plane, fly to Miami, get in a car, drive for 4 hours to the end of the Keys, and then get on a boat and go out for 10 miles into the Bay of Florida, and there on these tiny little postage stamp sized islands, you can find tiny populations of the Miami blue butterfly. Now, I wanted to tell you a few stories about these butterflies just to first let you know what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking of biodiversity conservation. These are species that are really on the edge of extinction. They need conservation attention. But the other reason I show you these butterflies is to get you thinking about why it is that there's a conservation problem. And for all these butterflies, the conservation problem is the same, and like for many or maybe most of our rarest species, the problem is habitat loss, the severe effects of habitat loss on loss of species. And so just to kind of step back a little further from these specific problems of the rare butterflies, here I'm showing you forest cover in the United States from about the time of European colonization through to the turn of the last century. And I work in forests in the southeast. This is an area called longleaf pine savanna. And as you look over this 300-year period, the amount of forest remaining by the end of that time is barely distinguishable from the specks of dust that are on my slide. And this problem of habitat loss was a problem historically. It continues to be a problem today in various places across the world. This example is of tropical forest in Brazil that's being cut into for roads, and then people are building, making agriculture in what was forested areas. Habitat loss is a problem for biodiversity. And I don't need these two guys to tell you that the problem of habitat loss is the most important one for the loss of species. We can measure in many kinds of ways how loss of habitat affects the loss of species, whether it be my rare butterflies or many other species that have gone extinct or are on the brink of extinction. Habitat loss is clearly the major problem in loss of species. But what I want to get you to thinking about today is not just the effects of habitat loss, but a second problem. Here's another example of habitat loss from the state of Wisconsin, where oak forests are being carved up and planted in the 1800s, planted for agriculture. And so as you go from, as you go from 1830 to 1950, you can see on this slide that most of the habitat has been lost. But the habitat that remains isn't one big park in the center of my slide. Rather, the habitat that remains is in small parcels. These are woodlots that are spread out across the landscape. And so the point I want to make here is that, yes, lots of habitat is lost, but the habitat that remains is fragmented and spread across the landscape, and those small areas of habitat can only support small populations that are even further threatened with the possibility of extinction. And so I like to show this slide as a way to getting us thinking about how do we do conservation in habitats that have been lost and have been fragmented. So this is a slide that was made, a picture that was made 40 years ago by Ed Wilson and his student Ed Willis. And they were thinking about principles in ecology, principles from the study of islands, and asking how can we take our knowledge from ecology and apply it to conservation in landscapes that have been fragmented. And they said, all right, listen, if we have equal areas of habitat to conserve, what would be the best way to conserve those habitats to protect the greatest number of species? And so they said, all right, well, if we have an equal amount of habitat, it would be better to keep that habitat in one big block, one big park, than keep those habitats separated from each other into smaller fragments that have smaller populations. It'd be better to keep habitats more compact rather than to have them be geometrically kind of long and deformed in a way that introduces a lot of effects of edges with surrounding agricultural urban areas into natural areas. And it would be better to keep habitats connected by corridors, the theme of my talk, than to have them separated from one another. And I'd like to show this slide to start off the talk, because this slide made 40 years ago has been one of the key slides in generating the discussion and debate about how we do conservation in fragmented landscapes. And none of these discussions on single large or several small patches, whether to have less or more edge or whether to have corridors, none of these discussions have actually been resolved in the last 40 years. And we've learned that there's lots of nuance along the way. And so it's been an interesting problem for me to work on whether these corridors that connect habitat fragments actually work to protect biodiversity. And so one question is, how is it that we expect these corridors to work? And so I'm going to give you an example with my butterflies, where I have populations that are spread in fragments across the landscape. And the idea is that if their populations are fragmented and one population goes extinct, if butterflies are limited to the fragments and don't have the ability to move across the landscape, then they're stuck, and those populations won't be recolonized and won't be maintained. And so the idea then is, if you add a corridor, that you give butterflies, animals, plants access to greater parts of the landscape, increase their potential population size and persistence across the landscape, and therefore increase biodiversity. And so since these corridors have been proposed, they've become very popular in how we think about conservation. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how corridors have been used. The first is a really small example. This comes from my region in North Carolina, where a local land conservancy spent about $100,000 to purchase this area, the light green corridor, to connect 2 areas of forest. This area is near Duke University, and this is a county open space, to create a corridor and use that approach to conservation. And there's small corridors like this I can point to. I can point to bigger corridors. This was from our state here of California. This is a diagram of corridors from what was known as the Missing Linkages Project. It identified the highest priority corridors across the state. Many of these corridors are what I think of as like lines on a map, people daydreaming about how we can best conserve corridors across the landscape. And so some of these corridors will never become reality. But what I know for sure is that 19 of the corridors in the densest part of California, down here between LA and San Diego, have been conserved for the price of tens of millions of dollars to conserve species like mountain lions and other species. And then there's the grandfather of all corridors. This is the Yellowstone to Yukon corridor that extends 1,800 miles from Yellowstone National Park up through Canada into the Yukon territories. And I like this graphic because it's sort of a glasses half empty, glasses half full picture. The highlighted area is the conservation region that folks would like to protect. The actual conserved area is in green. And the green areas are big. They don't fill up the entire conservation area, but they're big. And I can tell you that the Nature Conservancy 2 years ago spent $500 million to conserve habitat and connect the corridor down in Montana. Now, they take these corridors seriously in the Canadian Rockies. This is the Banff Jasper area. I don't know if anybody's been to that region. I went a couple of years ago and made sort of a pilgrimage to this major corridor. And the cool thing here is that where there are, where the corridor is broken, so where there are interstates running through the landscape, they have wildlife overpasses. So behind me is a bridge, and if you squint, you can see little saplings growing up from the overpass that connect this landscape and help to maintain this corridor. Now, corridors have become popular in conservation because of their role in reducing habitat fragmentation, but in the last decade, they've become even more popular because of the interaction between habitat fragmentation and this other major global change, which is climate change. Now, we've heard a lot about climate change and its potential effects. If you think through how it is that climate change might affect diversity, probably the leading way that it affects diversity is by causing ranges of species to shift, but then species have to shift their ranges through landscapes that are fragmented, that is, where they can't move upward in elevation or poleward to get to cooler places. And so they get stuck in fragmented landscapes, and their populations may go extinct because they can't get to cooler places as climate warms. And so because of this interaction, and so just to give you a kind of schematic of how this, this effect works. So here I've got 3 species that differ in their characteristics, from the good dispersing generalist to the poor dispersing and specialist species. And what we'd expect is that if species have to move poleward in latitude to get from one natural area to another, if there's urban or agricultural areas in the way, they may not be able to make it as their ranges shift to cooler places. They might need ways to get from one end of their range to the other, and so the idea is to make corridors, either big corridors that connect all the way through climate, or overpasses, wildlife bridges, or crossings that help to get species across particularly broken areas or big barriers that are in the landscape. And so because of this effect of habitat fragmentation and climate change, corridors have become particularly popular in how we think about management. And so we see big plans for implementing corridors. This is a pamphlet that came out from the Western Governors Association. That is the association of all the governors of the Western state, and they mandated that each state in the Western US come up with a plan to connect its landscape and create corridors, both to reduce the effects of habitat fragmentation and the effects of climate change. And one of the best plans came out of the state of Washington, the Washington Connected Project, and they came up with really bold plans for reconnecting their landscape between conserved areas in green and across other kinds of landscape uses. And when we look across the world in corridors, there's big plans to reconnect landscapes. So these are international corridors that occur on the border, for example, of India and Nepal for tigers, or through Central and South America for jaguars. There's big corridors like this. There's smaller visions of corridors. This is designed for a wildlife-friendly wildlife crossing. And I love this vision for a connection that has this nice painting of all these animals using the corridor. And if you go over into the very far corner over here, you'll see butterflies using this crossing, which I particularly like. Now, there's all these plans for corridors, but the question in the end is, do these corridors work? I mean, that's what this bear is wondering, whether it should cross the road and use a corridor to get to the other side. Do these corridors work as they're intended by increasing the dispersal of plants and animals through the landscape? Do they then work, after they've increased dispersal, to increase the persistence of populations of rare species, or to increase the diversity of species in fragmented landscapes? Well, that's what my lab's been working on for the past 2 decades. And so what I want to do now is shift a little bit in the talk to talk about corridors, but very experimental approaches to understanding this question of whether corridors work. And so I'm an experimental ecologist. I work in large experiments for ecology. And so the context of most of my experiments has been, and the slide's a little dark here, but I'll just tell you, this is pine plantation forest. If you've been to the southeastern United States, you will know that we have converted a lot of our agricultural lands to row crop forestry. And so in these pine plantations, we worked with the U.S. Forest Service to create experimental habitat fragments and corridors. And so what our experiment looks like is we have what we're calling habitat patches. These are a hectare in size. And then they're connected by a 150-meter-long corridor to another fragment that's a hectare in size. And then there are these isolated fragments that vary in shape. And I'll tell you a little bit about why later on in the talk. And just to give you a sense for what these experiments look like, we created our fragments by cutting pine trees. And people often ask, well, what you're cutting forests? Aren't corridors made of forest? Well, in our case, the native habitat was a savanna. Lots of grassland and a few trees. And so by cutting trees, we're pushing towards the natural habitat that occurred here. This is what ground zero looks like when we just created a corridor, but very quickly, the habitats are pushed towards the native vegetation that once occurred there, in part because we're restoring with the natural disturbances that once existed in these landscapes, which is fire. We burn every 2 to 3 years through our landscapes, and very quickly, diverse and productive vegetation and then animals following behind fill in our corridors and patches. And here's the view, just to put this in context. Here's the view from our, the surrounding forest into one of our patches. The pine trees are planted so densely here that very little grows in the understory outside of our patches. And so there's a strong contrast between the surrounding habitat and the patches and corridors themselves that are lush and diverse. And just to give you a sense for what our habitats look like, we put together a small video, just about 30 seconds, but just to give you a sense for what the patches and environments look like and the kind of species that we study. We do big experiments, so we've got lots of people out doing elaborate work. We put in other kinds of experiments. We've done work with bumblebees, for example. We've planted plants of restoration interest and monitor their growth and development. Our latest experiment is shown here. We're trapping wind-dispersed seeds as they disperse through our landscapes. And so we take a very experimental approach. We work on all sorts of plants and animals, and we're really trying to wring as much as we can out of understanding how corridors affect the ecosystems that we're studying. And so I'm coming back to the butterflies, again, my favorite species group. Actually started the work all to study butterflies. And so this is just one example of the way that we understand whether corridors work. This is the common buckeye butterfly. It's very common in our experimental patches and corridors. We can catch lots of them and release them. People ask, well, how do you mark and track a butterfly? Well, we use magic markers, essentially, and mark on their wings like a barcode in the supermarket, and then can assign them an individual code. We know where we mark them, we know where we capture them again, and we know whether or not they use corridors. And so this is the kind of data we get. Here what I'm showing is, on the y-axis, the proportion of butterflies that moved to another patch. And that patch was either connected by a corridor or not connected. And in this case, buckeye butterflies move twice as much between connected patches than unconnected patches. Now, I just wanted to walk through one example with this one butterfly species, because we've done detailed mark recapture studies on all sorts of plants and animals. And so my next slide is going to just summarize over a whole bunch of different kinds of species. And so the first few bars here show butterflies, buckeye, and variegated fritillary, and carpenter bees. On the y-axis here, what I'm showing is the percent increase in movement between connected patches. And so the point to make here is that 100% increase means double the movement rate between connected than unconnected patches. And the point I want to make as I start flashing up different species is that the effects of corridors are consistent across lots of different plants and animals, and large, typically doubling the effects of movement rates or greater than double movement rates. So that's true for insects, it's true for pollen. We've looked at pollination through our corridors of different plants, lantana, black-eyed Susan, passion flower. It's true for dispersal of plants. These are plants that are dispersed by birds, and so we've looked at winterberry, American holly, winged sumac, pokeweed, wax myrtle, all move more frequently between connected patches. And it's true for small mammals like the old field mouse and cotton rat. For over 20 species that we've done detailed mark recapture on, almost all have moved more frequently between connected patches. Now I say almost all, but it's not all. 2 species that we've worked with have moved more frequently between, or have not moved more frequently between connected patches. Corridors have no effect. This was true for one butterfly, the spicebush swallowtail, and one small mammal. And the kind of general point to take here is that these species happen to be the biggest and most generalist of the taxa, the butterflies or the small mammals that we worked with. But another point I like to make is that just for truth in advertising, the whole experiment was initially designed around this one butterfly, the spicebush swallowtail. We got the Forest Service to harvest hundreds of acres of pine trees and protect over 1,000 acres for our experiments. We raised caterpillars and eggs and caterpillars to butterflies so I could release butterflies of known age into our experiments. We tried to control the distribution of the butterfly's food plant, sassafras, over thousands of acres, which proved to be total folly. And we did this all for the species that didn't use corridors. It was a great lesson in thinking about how you set up experiments and what you might learn. It turned out in the end to be a great lesson learned for me in that I could start to think more clearly about which species would I expect to use corridors and which species would I expect not to use corridors. Okay, I want to move on from this point that most species move more frequently through corridors to a second point. Because for these corridors to work, they can't just increase movement. They have to have impacts in ways that we think about conservation. They have to have impacts on the persistence of species, or they have to have impacts on the diversity of species. And so in 2000, just after we had, oh, that got cut off. 2000, that's supposed to say. Just after we had created one set of our experimental areas, my former student, Ellen Damshin, who's shown in this slide, set up a sub-study within the experiment. She set up nested plots like this. Oh, backwards. All right. Set up nested plots like this one, where she could track the diversity and abundance of plants in our landscape. And she set up not just one, but 1,300 of these nested plots, and then track them not just for that year or the time of her dissertation, but we're actually continuing as collaborators to this day. She's now a professor at University of Wisconsin. And we could then ask, how do these corridors affect the diversity of plant species in our landscape? And let me show you what we found. On the x-axis here, I have the year. Actually, this graphic could go out even to this year because we're still collecting these data. On the y-axis, what I'm showing you is the difference in plant species richness between connected and unconnected patches. And I'm showing you the difference as the relevant metric because there's a lot of variation in the number of plant species we see from one year to the next, caused by weather or things that we don't know about. We just want to understand, how is it that corridors affect the number of plant species. And so in the first year, when this experiment was created, there was no difference in the number of species between connected and unconnected patches. And this is good, because we just set up this experiment, and there wouldn't have been time for the plant communities to respond to the landscape manipulations, the experiment that we had created. So it was a good thing that we set up our experiment in a way that didn't bias the subsequent results of our study. But then we tracked plant species richness from one year to the next, and for the next 6 years, the number of plant species in connected patches rose relative to the number in unconnected patches. So that by 2005, there were nearly 20 more plant species in connected patches. Now, this effect is huge. Just to give you a sense for how big of a difference this is, there are about 100 total plant species in any one of our patches. So there's 20% more plant species in connected patches, all due to the effects of our corridors. Corridors have a big effect on diversity, and I have to say that it's much more rapid than I ever expected the effect would occur. And then not only that, we've tracked now through 2010 on this graphic and through 2013, and the effect has persisted over now 13 years. So it seems to persist over long time periods. Now, oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, because this is interesting data, how big were these patches? I may have missed it. You said
They are a hectare.
The
patches are a hectare in size, and the corridors are 25 meters wide and 150 meters long.
Isn't that succession, just succession after removing a monoculture?
It's not succession, so that's why I've shown the difference here. So what you see through successional time is initially some increase in the total number of species per patch, and then a slight decrease over the 13 years. But what I'm showing here is just the difference between connected and unconnected patches. So there are successional dynamics, there's year-to-year dynamics due to other things, weather, and especially precipitation. But what I'm showing here is isolating the difference between connected and unconnected patches. And so this is all due to the corridor effect. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
And did you have another question as well?
That was it, thanks.
I meant to say, feel free to chime in. I actually can't see well if people have their hands raised, so just yell out. Okay. Now, in thinking about these corridors, we're often thinking about the positive effects. How do these corridors increase the dispersal of plants and animals? How do they increase diversity? But we worry about and often think about the potential for these corridors to have negative effects. Do they increase the spread of unwanted disturbances, the spread of predators or other antagonists of species that we're trying to conserve, or the spread of diseases through the landscape? This has been a problem that conservation biologists have wondered about for over 25 years, and yet we haven't had the data to ask whether these negative effects actually exist and whether we should be worried about them when we create corridors. And so just in the last, especially few years, our group has started to compile a good compendium of data to address these potential negative effects of corridors. And I don't have time to go through all, and I'm going to kind of summarize what we know and just give you a couple examples that I think are the most interesting, but I'm happy to talk more about this further. The first thing I want to address is this issue of whether corridors spread invasive species. I just showed you that corridors increase plant diversity. We asked whether these effects of corridors on plant species richness were due to effects on native or invasive species. And in particular, we asked whether the species we'd want to benefit from our corridors, that is, the species that are of interest in restoration in our habitats, longleaf pine savannas, increased in the presence of corridors. And so what I'm showing you here is just that subset of species, the species that are of restoration interest in our region, and how they respond to corridors. And it turns out that they, like for overall number of species, increase in the presence of corridors, and that's a significant effect. But then we separately looked at the effects on invasive and exotic species, and it turns out they don't show any response to the presence of corridors. In our landscape, what we think is happening is that exotic species, some are planted and they don't become invasive, so they don't spread whether or not there's a corridor. Other species are invasive, and they're so invasive, they're such good dispersers, they don't need our corridors to get around the landscape. And I think if I look across the broader literature that that's also true, that we don't see evidence for conservation corridors spreading invasive species. The really, truly nasty invasives get around whether or not those conservation corridors are there or not. And so we've looked at several different ways that corridors might have negative effects. So this is my summary slide where we've worried about whether corridors affect invasions. Here I've got a really southeastern example where I've got kudzu plants spreading down the corridor. Well, we don't see effects of corridors on spread of invasive species. We worry that corridors might spread antagonists. So here as my antagonist, I'm thinking about mesopredators that predate bird nests where we might care about some bird species. Well, we don't see that corridors may be moving around predators, but they don't seem to be reducing the persistence of rare populations. Folks have worried about whether corridors affect the spread of disturbance. There's no good evidence that they do in a negative way. Sometimes we want those disturbances spread through the landscape, and corridors can have even a positive role in spreading disturbance. I would say the one way that corridors can have negative effects that has been shown in repeated studies is through their creation of edge effects. So corridors tend to be long and skinny. That means they create more interface between the habitat that we're trying to conserve and the surrounding agricultural or urban landscapes. And those edges provide a way for species to potentially get into the habitats that we're concerned about. And so just as one example from our own experimental study, I want to show you what I think is a cool result, even though really not a good result, but a cool result from work done by my former student, Amy Weldon. She was interested in how corridors affected the nest productivity of what is considered an edge nesting bird, the indigo bunting. And so for this part of the study, what I want to point out is how our experiment has been set up to separate effects of corridors from these edge effects that I was just talking about. We have different kinds of patches. We have patches that are connected by corridors. We have isolated patches that have corridors that don't connect to anything. That's to control for this shape that corridors have and these potential edge effects. And then we have patches that are as big as this patch, but they're in the shape of a rectangle. That is, they're more compact and have less edge. Well, as is known, or was thought for indigo buntings tend to select edgy places. They're edge-loving birds. And we know this in part because we can determine the age of indigo buntings from their plumage. And older males tend to choose edgier places. And then my bird friends tell me that we expect the older males to make wiser choices. And so they're selecting the places that seem best for them in their landscape. But the interesting thing is that the nesting success of the indigo buntings is lowest in the edgier patches. And those edgier patches are whether they're connected by there's connections between patches or not. What we think is happening is that these edgy environments are actually creating something we think of as an ecological trap for birds. They're selecting places where they do the worst in these landscapes. And so just to kind of come back around to this issue of negative effects of edges and corridors, where we know that corridors might create negative edge effects, then we do want to think about making wider corridors and making corridors that have softer edges, that is, less abrupt transitions than what we have in our landscapes between the habitat that we're protecting and the surrounding habitat. Now, I want to end on the experiments by just putting our experimental results in context. Now, I know this is a conference about biodiversity, focused on biodiversity, and when we think about biodiversity conservation, we're thinking more about natural landscapes than the kinds of experiments that I'm telling you about. But what I want to try to do here is make the case that we need experiments, and the experiments can be informative in telling us about what goes on in the real world. Now, my first graphic I'm going to show you, and this work was done by somebody who I don't know, Gilbert Norton et al. They reviewed all of the corridor literature to ask whether there were positive effects of corridors. And so they did a meta-analysis, what's called the meta-analysis. On the y-axis here is an effect size, so values above 0 would mean a positive effect of corridors on dispersal or diversity or what have you. And this initial graphic sort of speaks to the concern that some of you might have. Here they've separated natural corridors. They could be forests, grasslands, whatever, but studies, observational studies done in real landscapes from studies done in experiments. And what you see is that in natural corridors, there's stronger and more positive effects of corridors on dispersal and diversity than in these manipulated experiments. But in this case, the manipulated experiments are small plots, little grassland plots, or they might even be microcosm experiments that are in petri dishes or in vials on a lab top. What they also did is separated the results from our experiment, the Savannah Riverside experiment, which is the largest corridor experiment. And I was excited to see that the results from our experiment were equal in size and magnitude to the results found in all natural corridors when those studies were combined. And so we think that our study is a good model system to inform us about how these corridors work. Now, for the last part of my talk, I want to transition to work that I'm looking forward to. I am on sabbatical this year at Stanford, and I'm working with a group called the Natural Capital Project, who thinks about the value of conservation areas as in the many different ways people get benefits from conservation. And so, coming around to my corridor studies, I've worked on the ecology of corridors for 20 years, and I can tell you that our experiments speak to the fact that corridors work. But the question I often get is, are these corridors worth it? How much should we pay for the benefits of corridors as opposed to other kinds of conservation measures we might take? And if, it's sort of obvious if the price of a corridor is equal to the price of some other kind of conservation area that might make a habitat bigger. But how do we think more broadly about the effects of corridors for people? Now, I didn't intend to do this when I first proposed my talk title, but I've waded into a bit of a debate in conservation biology. For those of you who are following the conservation literature, you know that there have emerged two camps in terms of how we think about conservation. On one side is a group that is thinking about the intrinsic value of species and their conservation of them because they have a right to exist and because humans shouldn't be the cause of their extinction. And on another side is a group, and that group's led by the founder of conservation biology, Michael Soule. On the other side is a group led by Michel Marvier, who's at Santa Clara College, and Peter Kariva, who's the lead scientist at the Nature Conservancy, and they're arguing for the value of conservation for benefits that nature provides for people. And what happens is when these two groups, start building up their own ideas, they also can caricature the other. And so, this side tends to caricature this side as, the Grizzly Adams misanthropes who don't care about people at all, and then this side tends to caricature this side as the urbanites who really aren't thinking about conservation of rare species or really are unconcerned about rare species or environmental conservation. And so this has created what I think of as the great rift right now in conservation biology. I actually don't care much for this argument, and I don't care for it because I really honestly think we need both sides. And so what we really should be doing is not pointing the guns inward on conservation biologists, but rather thinking, how can we muster both of these arguments for more conservation? We need to build more bridges across these two groups. And of course, my bridge is going to be a corridor, if it wasn't obvious. And so what I'm thinking about is, what are the values that corridors have for people that go above and beyond their value in conserving biodiversity? Now, at one extreme, we can think about the big corridors, the Yellowstone to Yukon corridors that I talked about earlier, that connect big places. And these are, do provide lots of benefits for people, but they are able to also provide benefits for the biggest animals and the rarest animals that have the largest ranges. And even in these kinds of landscapes, we can think about benefits that connections have for people, like this wildlife crossing that connects what is otherwise a very connected landscape. The wildlife crossing benefits the animals that are subject to roadkill, but also people that are involved in vehicle-wildlife accidents. But then as we get into other kinds of landscapes that are less remote, that are closer to where people live, what I'd argue is that people are also thinking about things that are corridors or corridor-like. And so in agricultural landscapes and urban environments, there are riparian buffers that provide some function for wildlife, but they have other functions as well. They are buffers that prevent sediments and nutrients from getting into rivers and streams and then increase water quality. And so there are other kinds of benefits that those corridors provide. In agricultural landscapes, corridors might provide connections for pollinators and agents of pest control, biocontrol species that reduce pest abundances. And so people think about things that look like corridors, at least, in agricultural landscapes, and there are benefits there of having corridors and connections. And even in urban landscapes where there are greenways, people benefit from having greenways that actually connect, that get you from one place to another in a commute as you're driving along natural areas. These are very different kinds of corridors, but they sort of fit in thinking about how connections among the landscape benefits people and benefits biodiversity. And here one thing I want to really distinguish is that there's some kinds of corridors that provide benefits by their connectivity, moving plants and animals through the landscape, which is also important for moving around species that are important in biocontrol or beneficials in agricultural landscape. They can be important to provide connectivity and recreation for example, commuting in the rails, trails, and greenways. And having connections are beneficial for water regulation. But some other kinds of corridors are just beneficial because of their presence. They don't have to actually connect to have a riparian buffer that increases water quality or makes a barrier between one farmer property and the next. But the thing I would point out is that these kinds of benefits vary across the landscapes where people live or don't live. And so if I array the kinds of landscapes that we might find that range from very densely human-settled landscapes to the more remote places that are typically thought of as our protected areas. And then I've also, on the y-axis here, related that to the size of the landscapes and corridors. That there is some relationship between these two. About at this far end, you get the big corridors that can sustain this great diversity of plants and animals that need big open places. And then as landscapes get more dense, then corridors tend to get smaller, but also provide more services for people because they're closest to people. And so when I think about a graphic like this one, what I think is that, as you go out in this direction, you're going in places that have more opportunities for conservation, again, of some of the rarest things that need to be furthest from people. As you go in this direction, you get closer to people, and so the corridors tend to provide more services just because they're next to where people live and the kinds of services they can get from protecting areas. But I think when you take all this together, along with the science that we've been working on for the past couple of decades, then I would kind of end with two messages. And one message is that I think the science shows, and even thinking about some of the services that ecosystems provide for people, that, that there should be more connections, that fragmented landscapes should become less fragmented, that corridors can help restore continuity to the landscape, and that where there are linear features on the landscape, like riparian buffers, that taking into account species and people would cause our conservation efforts to create more connections in the landscape. And then when you take into account the needs of species and people, I think it will end up pushing those corridors to be wider. If we think about just one of these factors, species or people, we can think about our corridors in one way that might lead them to be, especially for people, more narrow, for example, for buffers or greenways. But if we take into account all the benefits that corridors provide for people and for biodiversity, it's going to tend to widen those corridors and make them bigger on the landscape. Now, I want to end with two slides. First, I want to put in a plug for my group's website, conservationcorridor.org, where we're trying to bring together the conservation and the new science that we're learning about corridors with the folks that are actually putting corridors on the landscape, and so connecting the scientists and managers through dialogue on the website. And then finally, I want to thank the whole team of people that's made all the research and ideas that I've talked to you about today possible. So thank you very much. I would be happy to answer any questions. Appreciate it. Hey.
How do you reconcile some corridors that are beneficial to certain species can be dividers for other species? I mean, just looking at the photo you had of, I guess it was in Wyoming, the mountain pass with the river, I'm sorry, the canyon with the river running through it. You've got a corridor for fish, for example. But you have a separation for animals on either side of that corridor.
Yeah. So let me answer that question in two ways. So the question is, how do you reconcile landscapes that where corridors can be beneficial for some species but barriers for others? I want to answer first by telling you what I know most about, which is our experiment. I told you that when I set up that experiment, it was just for butterflies. What has shocked me about that experimental landscape is how many kinds of species benefit from the corridors that we have. And so it's been surprising that one corridor put on the landscape can benefit so many species. A second level to this answer is that it is possible to make corridors for one species, like an umbrella species or a flagship species, that wouldn't benefit other species. And we've worked on this problem in our southeastern landscapes where people generally make corridors with red-cockaded woodpeckers in mind. And we asked whether those red-cockaded woodpeckers would conserve frogs and butterflies that use different habitats. And the answer is you can actually make corridors that benefit all species, but you have to know something about them and where they move through the landscape. Now, you can get to the case that you're describing where species just have completely different needs for dispersal habitat. And in those landscapes, what is really critical is to conserve a diversity of habitats. And so a person named Paul Beyer, who is out of Northern Arizona University, advocates an approach called conserving landscape facets. And the idea is that you're conserving a variety of geological or geographic forms, and in the case of climate change, that becomes critically important, where you're thinking about different elevations or places in the landscape that could provide refugia for species. So it is important to think about conserving a variety of elements in the landscape that benefit the greatest variety of species. Other questions? Yes. Yeah.
Large poached animals, does that make it kind of a hotspot for poachers to start
Great question. So the question is, if you're working in landscapes where there's poaching, for example, do corridors and movement conduits provide places of entry? Now, honestly, I don't know examples of where those problems exist, but what I do know is that, I've spent a lot of time thinking about lion conservation in Africa, where human wildlife interactions can be a problem for the persistence of lions, and the lion populations that are doing best are often the small populations that are fenced and contained. But then that creates other kinds of barriers that we're worried about for migration on those big landscapes. And so I don't know of any good evidence that corridors are places that people target, but clearly where they are, there has to be some additional effort to working with local people to reduce their potential impacts. I saw another question over here, yeah.
Since the ranges of a lot of species are limited, how do you account for where you place the corridors to maximize dispersal? That's kind of a loaded question.
All right, wait, say the first part, I didn't hear.
Well, the ranges of many species are limited, so how do you plan where you're actually placing corridors to maximize dispersal?
Now, when you're thinking of ranges being limited, are you thinking the ranges of population or the total geographic range of?
The individuals that are moving.
Yes.
To disperse. So if you're planning a corridor where only maybe one is the range of one animal, you're not really helping a lot. So I was just wondering how you.
And so just to clarify, are you thinking about, when you say of one animal, you're worried that that animal might have too small a range and other species, or it's too big? Because there's two ways of thinking about it.
Well, if there's just only one animal, individual of the population in the area is going to have access to that part of the corridor, because the other animals aren't going to go into its range. So I'm just
Here, like a mountain lion, for instance? Something like that.
one in that area which would actually have access to the corridor.
Would have access to it, got it.
It's just how did you plan for where you place them to maximize?
So there is, I will say that there's a lot of this where you'd benefit from lots more detailed information about species. And so where I thought you were going originally, the question, I've been asked to repeat the question. The question is, how do you place a corridor that would allow or maximize the number of types of species that go into the corridor? Now repeating the question, I forgot where I was going with my answer. What I thought you were going was going to be to ask this question, which is, when you think about the dimensions of corridors, like for some corridors, they could be short enough that a species could make it through in its lifetime. Let's take the mountain lion example. You might have miles-long corridors, but in its lifetime, or in even a short part of its life, it might make it through the corridor. Whereas other kinds of species, short dispersing animals or plants, might not make it in its lifetime and then might have to hop over many generations down a corridor. And so there is a difference between the kinds of species that pass through corridors and the kind that must dwell in the corridor. If you're designing a corridor for species that have to live in the corridor, then it's a matter of corridor dimension. They have to be wider. But beyond that, if you knew you had specific knowledge about the landscape for a species, then you just have to think about how to place it relative to species. But you often don't have that kind of opportunity. And what we're looking for is more general places to put corridors on the landscape that will benefit the most species. Yeah, go ahead.
Isn't use of the term corridor, isn't it such an imprecise? The problem here is such an imprecise, almost unscientific term, not well-defined scientifically at least. And I was wondering about corridor landscape linkage. Is there a difference in your mind in those terms scientifically? And if so, what is it? And if not, why not?
So you're right that corridor, what is a corridor, defines an immensely broad range of connections. And what I would call a corridor is just a place that reduces movement through the landscape, right? So that's a very broad definition. And then if you kind of want to think more specifically about, for example, wildlife crossings that are very small connections in the landscape that increase movement, or at a large scale, people want to call conservation corridors, corridors that are at least 500 meters wide and at least 5 kilometers long that can increase the passage of the biggest species. But it is an attempt to try to constrain what kinds of connections that we're talking about. Now, the second part of your question was, you said defining a
Landscape
linkage,
linkage.
okay. And so then there's this other issue. What I've stayed away from is a broader term that people will use, which is about landscape connectivity. That is, any part of the landscape that will reduce movement through the landscape. What I've been talking to you about are what I think of as structural corridors. There's actually a physical connection in the type of habitat between the patches and the corridors, and they're similar. And my own view is that that's the most general way to enhance connections, because what's been demonstrated is that the most species will use the habitat that's like, in a corridor that's like the habitat that it lives in. But it's also true that there are certain kinds of uses of the surrounding landscape that are different from the patch or corridor itself that can facilitate movement. And so we often call this softening the matrix, or reducing the nature of the surrounding habitat as a barrier. And so that's what I started thinking about, things like, landscape linkages or safe passages that